Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. The road north out of Kuwait was no road anymore. It was a graveyard of engines and flesh, a scar carved into the sand. Burned trucks lay like carcasses of steel, their cargo fused into the asphalt. Along what soldiers would later call the Highway of Death, the remnants of Iraq's once proud army stumbled homeward. Men without helmets, without orders, some barefoot, some clutching broken rifles. They had fled the liberation of Kuwait, believing the desert would swallow their retreat. But above them circled the slow shadow of an AC-130 gunship patient as a vulture. When it struck, the night bloomed white, and the dunes reflected the fire like an ocean of glass. For millions who watched from the safety of television screens, this was the image that defined the Gulf War: 100 hours of combat reduced to one unforgettable sight, a road burning in the dark. Yet that image was also the beginning of something new. It was the first conflict the modern world would witness in real time, where war wasn't just fought, but broadcast. The smell of oil and smoke drifted beyond the desert into every living room tuned to CNN. The Gulf had become both battlefield and stage. To understand how this began, how a border dispute spiraled into the most televised war in history, we must turn back 7 months to a different kind of silence. In the summer of 1990, Iraq's leader Saddam Hussein believed himself destined for empire. He had survived an 8-year war with Iran that consumed 500,000 lives and left his nation buried under debt. To his people, it was a victory. To his creditors, it was insolvency. Iraq owed tens of billions to Kuwait and Saudi Arabia and had no means to pay. In Baghdad's marble halls, Saddam called it betrayal. He argued that Iraq had fought Iran not just for itself, but for the Arab world, shielding its Sunni neighbors from Khomeini's revolution. The least they could do, he said, was forgive the debt. When they refused, his fury hardened into grievance. Oil prices fell. Kuwait increased production beyond its OPEC quota. To Saddam, this was more than economics. It was war by other means. At night, his advisors spread maps across polished tables, maps once drawn by British officials who could never have imagined their ink would still dictate life and death in the Gulf. A single pencil line through empty sand marked the border between Iraq and Kuwait. Saddam pointed to it and declared that history had been stolen. He saw Kuwait not as a neighbor, but as a fragment of Iraq amputated by empire. It was hours before the British took it, he told his generals. In that conviction, he found justification for everything that followed. The Iraqi army of 1990 was vast, nearly 1 million men battle-hardened from the Iranian front. Their tanks were Soviet-built, their morale uncertain, but they obeyed. On the first night of August, the air was windless as armored columns rolled toward the Kuwaiti frontier. By dawn, they had crossed it. Resistance crumbled within hours. Civilians watched from their windows as black smoke rose from Dasman Palace, where Kuwait's emir barely escaped. The invasion had lasted less than a day. Baghdad celebrated. State radio played patriotic marches. Saddam appeared on television to proclaim that the 19th province of Iraq had come home. In the west, the news broke before noon. Cameras caught oil fires blooming against the horizon, and anchors spoke of naked aggression. President George H.W. Bush, awakened at Camp David, used the same phrase. To the rest of the world, it seemed that one man's pride had shattered the balance built since World War II. But beneath those headlines lay something older, a struggle for control of oil, the currency of the modern age. Whoever commanded the Gulf commanded the world. By nightfall, sanctions were already being drafted. Diplomats crowded into the United Nations chamber, their voices echoing under the weight of history. The desert outside Kuwait lay silent. The sky, once pale blue, had turned the color of ash. A single truck radio crackled through the static, playing half a song before the signal died. The smell of oil and smoke would linger long after the fires were out. It marked the birth of a new era, one where power would be projected not only through missiles and tanks, but through images broadcast into every home that would watch and remember. The war had begun not just in the desert, but in the way humanity would see itself at war ever after. When the guns fell silent in 1988, Iraq's soldiers returned from the Iranian front to parades and promises. Baghdad's avenues were lined with flags, but beneath the banners of triumph lay exhaustion. The war had devoured nearly everything: men, machines, and money. Iraq's treasury, once swollen by oil wealth, was hollow. Saddam Hussein's victory had left his nation bleeding internally. 8 years of war had drained the state's coffers to feed artillery and chemical shells. To keep the conflict alive, Iraq borrowed heavily from its Arab neighbors, especially Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. The loans were offered in the name of solidarity: Sunni states backing Baghdad against Tehran's Shia revolution. But when the war ended, those same allies wanted repayment. Iraq owed over $40 billion, and inflation gnawed at whatever economy survived. The empire Saddam imagined had no foundation. It stood on debt. Inside the Republican palace, Saddam raged. He saw not numbers, but betrayal. "We defended the Arab world," he shouted at ministers. "We bled for them." In his view, Kuwait and Saudi Arabia owed Iraq gratitude, not bills. When they refused to forgive the debt, he accused them of conspiring with the West to keep Iraq weak. His paranoia mixed with genuine grievance, and in that fusion disaster was born. At the same time, oil prices collapsed. Kuwait overproduced beyond its OPEC quota, flooding the market. Every extra barrel they pumped sent Iraq's revenue spiraling downward. Baghdad's newspapers began calling Kuwait a dagger in the Arab heart. Saddam summoned Kuwait's foreign minister and accused his tiny neighbor of waging economic warfare. The diplomat left pale and trembling. He had expected negotiation, not a threat. Meanwhile, Iraqi engineers alleged something more tangible: oil theft. They claimed Kuwait had drilled diagonally into the Rumaila field, siphoning crude from beneath Iraqi soil. It was difficult to prove, but in Saddam's mind, proof was unnecessary. The accusation turned debt into theft and grievance into justification. The state's propaganda machine amplified the story until rage became policy. Through 1989, Baghdad's radio played songs of reunification. School maps expanded Iraq's borders southward. History lessons blurred empire and geography. Soldiers were told they would soon march again, not as invaders, but as liberators reclaiming stolen land. By early 1990, armored divisions near Basra were training under a code name whispered through the barracks: the Southern Operation. Foreign diplomats saw the signs but underestimated them. Western analysts dismissed the troop movements as pressure tactics. After all, Saddam needed oil prices to rise, not another war. Few imagined he would gamble again so soon. But for Saddam, war was not just a tool, it was his language. Each risk had rewarded him before. He believed confrontation would again bring obedience. In one televised speech, he stared into the camera, his voice steady and cold. "We are not beggars," he said. "We are the sons of Babylon. We reclaim what was denied to us." Behind that declaration, tank engines were already warming. Convoys of armor began crawling south under cover of night dust plumes stretching for miles. By July, Arab leaders pleaded for calm. Talks in Jeddah collapsed within hours. As Kuwaiti delegates boarded their flight home, one turned to a colleague and whispered, "He will come." That night in Baghdad, the lights burned late. Maps of the Gulf lay pinned to the walls, red circles marking oil fields and highways. Generals discussed fuel and terrain. Saddam spoke of destiny. "We will not invade," he said. "We will return." The war born of debt, pride, and oil was about to begin. And in its heart lay an illusion older than empire itself, that conquest could erase humiliation and that power could be bought back in blood. The borders of the Middle East were never carved by the people who lived there. They were drawn in colonial offices by men in suits and smoked their rulers, tracing invisible lines across deserts they would never see. One of those lines, barely a pencil stroke, separated Iraq from Kuwait. To Britain in 1922, it was a matter of convenience. To Saddam Hussein 70 years later, it was a matter of destiny. He spoke often of Iraq as a wounded heir of Babylon, its ancient greatness dismembered by imperial arrogance. "The British stole our coast," he would remind his ministers. To him, Kuwait was not a nation, but an error, a fragment of Ottoman Basra that should have been Iraq's lifeline to the Gulf. Every speech replayed the same refrain: Iraq was not expanding, merely restoring what was taken. His nationalism was both a myth and a weapon sharpened for the moment when memory could justify conquest. Across Baghdad, the message took root. In classrooms, maps began to shift subtly southward. On radio, announcers spoke of the return of the 19th province. The slogan appeared on billboards, on murals, even on bread wrappers. For a population exhausted by debt and defeat, the idea of redemption through reclamation was intoxicating. Saddam had found something stronger than fear to control his people: nostalgia. But behind the theater of pride lay calculation. Iraq's access to the Gulf spanned only 30 miles of coastline, too shallow for tankers. Kuwait's deep water ports would give Baghdad leverage over global shipping and control of oil routes. Saddam wrapped this ambition in the costume of historic justice. Yet the motivation was brutally simple: money, access, survival. Still, diplomacy persisted. Arab leaders begged for mediation. Talks were arranged in Jeddah, but they were doomed from the start. Saddam's envoys arrived with demands that no sovereign state could accept: debt forgiveness, compensation for stolen oil, and border concessions. The Kuwaitis refused. When the Iraqi delegation flew home, one general muttered, "Then it is settled." That same week, Saddam hosted a meeting with a visitor who would become one of history's most controversial footnotes, U.S. Ambassador April Glaspie. It was July 25, 1990, just 7 days before the invasion. The discussion was polite, cautious. According to Iraqi transcripts, Glaspie told him that America had no opinion on Arab-Arab conflicts. Whether mistranslated or misinterpreted, Saddam heard what he wanted to hear: Washington would not interfere. It was not a green light, perhaps, but it was no red one either. For a man who ruled through hints and threats, silence sounded like permission. On the night of August 1st, Baghdad moved with quiet precision. Convoys of T-72 tanks and armored carriers rolled south, headlights, covered engines, whispering under the desert wind. Soldiers thought it was an exercise. Officers knew better. At 2:00 a.m., a radio code crackled through the static advance. The invasion unfolded like clockwork. In 4 hours, Iraq's Republican Guard crushed the Kuwaiti defenses. Many Kuwaiti troops were still asleep when shells began to fall. The emir fled his palace under gunfire, his motorcade vanishing into the Saudi border. By dawn, Iraqi tanks thundered into Kuwait City, their tracks grinding over marble. Looters followed, stripping everything from stores to telephone wires. At midday, Saddam's flag rose above government buildings. In Baghdad, the news broke before breakfast. State television played the national anthem, and crowds poured into Tahrir Square waving portraits of their leader. The historic wrong of 1922, the announcer declared, has been corrected. It was the fastest war Iraq had ever won, and the last. But outside Iraq, the world reacted with shock. In Washington, President George H.W. Bush convened an emergency meeting. In London, Margaret Thatcher warned that appeasement had returned. If he's not stopped, she told Bush, he'll have the whole Gulf in his hands. Her words were an echo from 1938 carried across sand. In Riyadh, King Fahd of Saudi Arabia watched the footage in silence. If Iraq could seize Kuwait in a day, it could take his kingdom in a week. Within hours, he sent word to Washington, "We need help." By nightfall, U.S. aircraft carriers were already moving toward the Arabian Sea. The wind over the Gulf carried the smell of diesel and burning oil. The map drawn by empires was about to be redrawn in fire. The invasion began without warning, without even a declaration. Only the low murmur of engines disturbed the desert. At 2:00 a.m. on August 2nd, 1990, the horizon filled with headlights. The elite Iraqi Republican Guard surged across the border like a metallic tide. Their tracks carved luminous scars through the sand, and tracer fire painted the sky with green and orange. Kuwait, half asleep, never stood a chance. Its army numbered barely 16,000 men on leave, most unaware they were already at war. By dawn, Iraqi tanks surrounded key installations, and resistance collapsed before it could form. Mirage jets took off from Al-Jaber Air Base, only to be chased back by Iraqi MiGs. The last pockets of defense centered on Dasman Palace, where Emir Jaber al-Ahmad al-Sabah awoke to gunfire echoing through marble halls. Guards fell one by one against the staircases as the emir was rushed out a rear corridor toward the Saudi border. Behind him, the city glowed red, its skyline swallowed by smoke and flame. Across Kuwait City, doors slammed and curtains closed as tanks rolled past. Looting began almost immediately. Stores, stripped banks, emptied homes searched. Radio Baghdad's voice cut through the static, triumphant, and cold. Kuwait has returned to its rightful home. Within hours, Saddam appeared on television beneath a portrait of Saladin, declaring the 19th province restored. But while Baghdad celebrated, the world watched in disbelief. At the United Nations, ambassadors scrambled into emergency session. Resolution 1660 condemned the invasion as naked aggression and demanded immediate withdrawal. Within 24 hours, economic sanctions froze Iraq's assets. In Washington, President Bush phoned London. On the other end, Margaret Thatcher's voice was sharp as steel. "This is no time to waver," she said. "If you don't act, he'll have the whole Gulf in his pocket." For King Fahd of Saudi Arabia, the threat was personal. Satellite images showed Iraqi armor massing along his northern border. The kingdom's army, though wealthy, was small. On August 6th, he sent an urgent appeal to Washington to protect the kingdom. The answer came in the roar of transport planes. American troops landed at Dhahran and Riyadh, greeted by shimmering heat and disbelief. Operation Desert Shield had begun. Its mission was defensive, at least on paper, but every soldier who stepped onto Saudi sand sensed the momentum of something larger. Saddam misread all of it. He told his generals the Americans were bluffing, that they would never die for oil or for Kuwait. He believed his revolution would outlast their patience, just as it had against Iran. His propaganda framed the invasion as a victory for Arab unity against Western imperialism. Crowds in Amman and Gaza carried his portrait, shouting his name as if he were Saladin reborn. But in Washington, the opposite narrative took hold. Bush called Iraq's act a threat to the New World Order, one that would define America's role after the Cold War. The line was drawn both political and moral. Iraq had crossed it. Meanwhile, in Kuwait, fear became a language of its own. Civilians whispered in basements. Government officials were rounded up, journalists vanished, and anyone caught aiding resistance disappeared. Witnesses later described the occupation as suffocating, like watching your country breathe slower each day. By mid-August, Iraqi control seemed absolute. But in reality, Saddam's empire was already eroding. Every day, new nations joined the chorus of condemnation. Every hour, more soldiers landed in Saudi Arabia. Above the Gulf, the sun set through a haze of smoke, turning the sky the color of iron. For the first time since the invasion began, the desert fell silent again. It was not peace, but the pause before an echo that would return with force enough to shake the century. When dawn broke over Washington, the president's advisors gathered in the Situation Room, eyes red from lack of sleep. The message was simple: Iraq had swallowed Kuwait whole. George H.W. Bush, calm but firm, spoke words that would become doctrine: "This will not stand." Across the Atlantic, phones rang in Downing Street. Margaret Thatcher's reply was immediate: "Then don't let it." Within hours, the United Nations Security Council met under floodlights and camera flashes. Diplomats moved with unusual unity. Even the Soviet Union, newly thawing from the Cold War, condemned Iraq. Resolution 1661 imposed sweeping sanctions, freezing trade in oil. Within a week, the world's mightiest powers, often divided, had aligned for the first time in decades. Saddam had done what no treaty could unite them. In Riyadh, King Fahd paced beneath chandeliers, his voice low with anxiety. Satellite photos confirmed what his generals feared: Iraqi divisions were digging in near the Saudi border. The kingdom's army was rich but inexperienced. If Saddam struck south, there would be no second Kuwait. On August 7th, Fahd formally requested American protection. The U.S. response came faster than anyone expected. Jet engines roared across the desert skies, heralding the beginning of Operation Desert Shield. Cargo planes unloaded tanks, artillery, and Patriot missile batteries. Soldiers built tent cities in the sand temporary metropolises of canvas and steel. They came from everywhere: Americans, Britons, Egyptians, Syrians, French Saudis. It was a gathering that felt biblical in scale, an alliance forged not just from politics but from fear. The soldiers who stepped onto Saudi soil faced a landscape that seemed unearthly. The heat shimmered above the dunes. The air smelled faintly of oil. At night, sand turned cold enough to bite. One Marine wrote in his notebook, "We're living on another planet. Everything moves, even the ground." Yet amid the discomfort was a strange sense of purpose, the feeling that history was forming, just beyond the horizon. In Baghdad, Saddam remained defiant. He mocked the buildup as Western theater, insisting that the Americans would never die for Kuwait. He appeared on television, smiling beneath portraits of himself in military dress, assuring Iraqis that God and justice were on their side. But privately, he underestimated the depth of what was coming. To him, the coalition's unity looked fragile, a mirage that would vanish in the heat. Washington, meanwhile, saw the opposite. For Bush, this was not just a regional crisis. It was a test of a post-Cold War order where aggression could no longer go unpunished. The message was moral and strategic alike. If Iraq could seize Kuwait and keep it, the entire system of international law would collapse. The stakes were not only barrels of oil, but the rules of civilization itself. By autumn, the numbers grew staggering. 500,000 coalition troops filled the Saudi desert, their vehicles lined up like beads across the dunes. Supply chains stretched across continents. American generals called it the largest movement of men and machines since World War II. In press tents, journalists broadcast rehearsed briefings beneath banners that read, "Coalition for Peace." Every camera angle was calibrated, every quote refined. This would not be Vietnam. Yet even as world opinion hardened, dissent rippled quietly through the Arab streets. In Cairo, Amman, and Gaza, protesters raised portraits of Saddam Hussein, calling him the last Arab leader who dared defy the West. To them, his invasion was not naked aggression, it was defiance dressed as justice. The arrival of American troops on Saudi soil near Islam's holiest cities sparked unease that would outlast the war itself. Through September and October, diplomacy played out like a slow drumbeat. Sanctions tightened, ultimatums were drafted, but Saddam refused to bend. He believed time favored him, that winter rains and global fatigue would erode the coalition's resolve. In New York, the United Nations issued its final warning, Resolution 678. Iraq had until January 15, 1991, to withdraw or face force by all necessary means. In the desert, soldiers began counting down the days. They scratched numbers into helmets and tent poles, whispering to one another about D-Day. When night fell, the horizon flickered with distant fires, oil rigs burning to keep their engines warm. To many, the air already smelled like war. The world had drawn its line in the sand. Now it waited to see who would cross it first. As the final days of 1990 slipped away, the desert seemed to hold its breath. The deadline imposed by the United Nations, January 15, 1991, hung over both armies like an hourglass of sand. In the north, Iraqi soldiers dug miles of trenches across the Kuwaiti border, laying mines and stringing barbed wire. They built berms of sand so high that satellites mistook them for dunes. Saddam called it the mother of all battles. His officers knew better. It was a wall of desperation. For the coalition Operation Desert Shield had already transformed into something far greater. The logistics were staggering: 900,000 soldiers from 42 nations, supplied by more than 5,000 aircraft and 2,000 tanks. Air bases sprouted from the desert, like cities' overnight runways shimmering in the heat. American generals plotted from steel trailers cooled by machines that hummed constantly, their maps glowing red and green in the dark. Every movement of Saddam's army was known, tracked by orbiting eyes in the sky. In Baghdad, the propaganda grew louder, more desperate. Saddam appeared in uniform on state television, holding a rifle and promising a graveyard for the invaders. Statues of him were erected beside murals of Saladin and Nebuchadnezzar, an unbroken line of conquerors stretching into myth. But his power was rotting underneath. Desertions increased, food was rationed. Rumors spread that the Americans could see through clouds and strike in the dark. "They have machines that see the heat of your body," whispered one conscript. "There is nowhere to hide." In Washington, the mood was equally tense. For President Bush, the choice had crystallized, diplomacy was finished. On January 12th, Congress approved the use of force. 3 days later, the deadline expired. Saddam remained defiant, parading captured foreign workers on television as human shields, forcing them to wave to the cameras beneath anti-aircraft guns. He mistook disgust for hesitation. At 2:38 a.m. on January 17, 1991, the first explosion struck Baghdad. The night turned green as Tomahawk cruise missiles tore through the sky. Operation Desert Storm had begun. CNN broadcast live from the rooftop of the Al Rashid Hotel. Viewers around the world watched tracer fire arc through the darkness. It was war as spectacle instant, framed and unreal. The coalition's air campaign was surgical and relentless. Within the first week, they flew more than 10,000 sorties. Radar stations vanished, airfields crumbled, communication towers collapsed. The precision of American technology seemed almost divine. The B-52 bombers operated so high that Iraqi gunners fired blindly, their shells bursting like fireworks in empty air. On the ground, soldiers huddled in bunkers that became tombs when the earth shook above them. In the first 24 hours, the coalition achieved what military theorists once thought impossible: total air superiority. Iraqi pilots, faced with annihilation, fled their aircraft across the border into Iran. One by one, their runways were erased from the map. When an entire squadron defected, leaving behind hundreds of planes, Saddam ordered their families imprisoned. Fear had replaced command. To the watching world, it felt like a new kind of war: cold, clinical, efficient. But beneath the illusion of precision, civilians suffered. Power plants, bridges, water facilities, all dual-use targets, were reduced to rubble. In Baghdad, hospitals ran on candlelight. Children filled buckets from the Tigris, the water thick with oil and ash. The city that had once been the heart of Abbasid brilliance now flickered in darkness. Still, the bombing never paused. American pilots described the sky as alive with targets. At dawn, the horizon would bloom orange, and by dusk, the desert would hum with the returning roar of engines, the smell of jet fuel mixed with scorched sand. From orbit, the Gulf glowed faintly in infrared, an entire war visible from space. Saddam tried to retaliate in the only way he could. His forces launched Scud missiles toward Israel and Saudi Arabia. Blind strikes meant to break the coalition apart. If Israel retaliated, the Arab states might abandon the alliance, but Israel held back. American Patriot missiles intercepted many of the Scuds, and Bush personally pleaded with Israeli leaders to stay silent. It was perhaps the coalition's most fragile triumph: unity maintained through restraint. By the end of January, Iraq's air defenses were gone. Its command centers were silent. Every bridge between Baghdad and the front was broken, yet the army still held the ground. In the trenches outside Kuwait City, the soldiers waited under skies that never cleared. They could hear the distant thunder of bombers even when the clouds were empty. For 38 days, the desert was a stage of fire and sound, and then at last the bombing stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than any explosion. Beneath that silence, hundreds of thousands of men waited for the next order, the one that would turn shield into sword. By late January 1991, the coalition's bombardment had carved through Iraq's command structure like a scalpel, but Saddam was not yet ready to yield. His generals brought him grim reports: communications, severed fuel, running out, morale collapsing. But the dictator refused to believe that his army was paralyzed. He needed a victory, however small, to prove that Iraq could still strike back. His chance came not in Kuwait, but across the border in the Saudi town of Khafji, a quiet fishing settlement that now stood as a symbol of the coalition's fragile front. On January 29th, as sandstorms whipped across the Gulf, Saddam gave the order. Hundreds of armored vehicles surged south under cover of darkness, headlights blacked out, engines whispering like ghosts in the wind. The goal was psychological: to show the world that Iraq could invade Saudi Arabia itself. For 2 days, Khafji burned. Coalition patrols were caught off guard. Iraqi T-55s rolled into the streets, their turrets turning like slow beasts under a crimson sky. American Marines and Saudi National Guardsmen fought house to house, radioing for air support that struggled to see through the choking dust. In Riyadh, reporters whispered that the mother of all battles had begun. But when dawn came, the illusion broke. Coalition aircraft, F-15s, A-10s, and British Tornadoes swept in above the clouds. The desert turned into a killing ground. Convoys were shredded tanks vaporized by precision bombs. One Iraqi commander tried to retreat north, only to find every road cratered, every escape line glowing under satellite surveillance. By February 1st, the surviving Iraqis abandoned Khafji, leaving behind hundreds of burned-out vehicles and the bodies of their comrades in the alleys. For Saddam, it was a bitter humiliation. The counterattack meant to rally his army had instead exposed its helplessness. Yet on Baghdad radio, The regime declared victory, calling Khafji a graveyard for the enemy. Posters of triumphant soldiers appeared overnight. The truth never left the borders. Inside the coalition, however, Khafji became something more than a tactical win. It was a test passed. It proved that the vast alliance of Western and Arab troops could fight together, that the Saudi army could stand under fire, and that coalition air power could erase an entire division in a matter of hours. Morale surged. The soldiers who had spent months baking under the sun suddenly believed in the inevitability of their mission. Still, the ground war had yet to begin. In bunkers near Kuwait City, Iraqi conscripts waited with rifles that jammed from sand. They ate dates and canned beans under dim lanterns, their officers repeating the same phrase, "Hold the line." Above them, jets screamed through the night. Some soldiers carved prayers into their helmets. Others whispered to one another that the Americans would never dare come close. In Riyadh, General Norman Schwarzkopf studied maps under the hum of fluorescent lights. His plan, refined for months, was bold feint attacks along Kuwait's coast to draw Iraqi attention east, then send the main force armored divisions, mechanized brigades sweeping through the open desert far to the west. The maneuver would come to be known as the left hook. It aimed to encircle the Iraqi army, entirely severing its retreat and crushing its elite Republican Guard. By early February, the bombing resumed with greater fury. Bridges collapsed into rivers of fire. Ammunition depots erupted like miniature suns. American B-52s loosed waves of bombs so dense that Iraqi soldiers called them the steel rain. At night, the horizon pulsed without pause. The desert no longer slept, it vibrated. On February 22nd, Bush sent a final ultimatum: leave Kuwait within 24 hours or face annihilation. Baghdad replied with silence. The countdown ended. In every tent and command post across Saudi Arabia, soldiers received the same order. Engines warmed, radios crackled, and men gripped their rifles in the cold dawn. After 6 months of waiting, Operation Desert Shield was about to transform into its final name, Operation Desert Saber. The storm that began in the skies was about to touch the ground. Before dawn on February 24, 1991, the desert came alive. Engines murmured like a heartbeat beneath the wind. Across hundreds of miles, American, British, French, and Arab armored divisions shifted from defense to movement. Operation Desert Saber. The ground phase had begun. For 6 weeks, the coalition had bombed Iraq into silence. Now it was time to cross the sand and break it completely. Everyone expected the main thrust to come from the south straight into Kuwait City. Iraqi commanders had prepared for that, digging labyrinths of trenches, planting minefields deep enough to swallow tanks. But General Norman Schwarzkopf had something else in mind. While feints struck the coast to fix Saddam's gaze eastward, the real assault swung wide to the west, deep into open desert no one thought an army could cross. It was a maneuver of scale unseen since Patton's advance through France. Under a black sky, 1,500 tanks and 300,000 soldiers moved in formation, guided only by night vision and GPS, the technology of a new age. The sands of southern Iraq, thought impassable, became their highway. French divisions advanced toward the town of Al-Salman, cutting off Iraqi supply routes. To the east, Arab coalition forces under Prince Khalid bin Sultan drove toward the Kuwaiti border, while U.S. Marines prepared to breach the main defenses head-on. The air hummed with anticipation, the kind that precedes an avalanche. When contact came, it was swift and surreal. Iraqi trenches that had taken months to dig collapsed in hours. Bulldozers pushed walls of sand over bunkers still occupied by terrified conscripts. Coalition tanks fired with impunity, their infrared sights turning night into daylight. One American described the battle as a video game, except the screams were real. Iraqi soldiers emerged from their holes waving white cloths, bewildered to be spared. Some kissed the boots of their captors, others wept in silence. Farther north, the U.S. 7th Corps unleashed the most powerful armored offensive since World War II. The desert shuddered under the weight of steel. In the confusion, one Iraqi officer radioed Baghdad. "They are not men, they are machines." Communication lines were severed, command crumbled, and entire divisions vanished from the map in a matter of hours. By the second day, coalition forces had penetrated deep into Iraq, cutting the highway between Basra and Kuwait. The elite Republican Guard divisions Tawakkalna Medina and Hammurabi now stood exposed. Schwarzkopf's trap had closed perfectly. The left hook had done what air power alone could not, surrounded the enemy. On the Kuwaiti front, U.S. Marines breached Saddam's defensive line, known as the Saddam Line, a 70-mile fortress of trenches, barbed wire, and flame-filled ditches. It collapsed in less than 6 hours. A Marine later recalled, "We were trained for Stalingrad. What we found was a ghost town. They advanced through smoke so thick it turned noon into twilight. Oil wells burned in the distance, ignited by retreating Iraqis in a last act of vengeance. Black rain fell across the sand. Amid the chaos, coalition casualties remained astonishingly low. In some sectors, Iraqi resistance disintegrated before a single shot was fired. Thousands surrendered in waves, hungry, sleepless, desperate." A British officer described the scene. "They came in droves, walking out of the smoke with their hands up like shadows that had decided to live." By February 26, the entire Iraqi position in Kuwait had collapsed. From space satellites recorded vast columns of armor fleeing north toward Basra. That retreat would soon become infamous, the highway of death. Coalition aircraft struck the convoys, relentlessly turning the road into a corridor of fire. Burned trucks, tanks, and buses stretched for miles. The images would sear themselves into the world's memory, both as symbol of victory and of horror. But even as victory neared, one order remained stopped short of Baghdad. The mission was never regime change, only liberation. To go further would mean occupying a nation of 20 million and fighting the ghosts of empire. By the night of February 27th, Kuwait City was free. The Kuwaiti flag, hidden for months, rose again above the battered skyline. Its citizens lined the streets, waving portraits of the emir as coalition tanks rolled through. The war that had begun with surprise ended with inevitability. In 100 hours, Iraq's army, the fourth largest in the world, had ceased to exist as a fighting force. The coalition had achieved one of the swiftest and most decisive victories in modern warfare. Yet as the soldiers rested and the cameras captured the burning horizon, few noticed what still lay beneath that smoke, the seeds of the next war waiting in silence. The retreat began before sunrise. Columns of Iraqi armor trucks and stolen civilian cars streamed north toward Basra, a tide of men desperate to survive. They believed the Americans would not strike them once Kuwait was lost. They were wrong. On February 26th, coalition aircraft spotted the convoys stretching for miles along Highway 80. Orders were given. Within minutes, the desert lit up like a forge. F-15s dove in first, their bombs bursting in rhythmic intervals, followed by A-10 Warthogs, strafing with 30mm cannons. Fuel trucks ignited like torches. Ammunition carriers erupted, scattering shrapnel across the sand. The road became an inferno. Some vehicles swerved off into the dunes only to be hit again. Pilots described it as a conveyor belt of targets. From orbit, satellites saw a single line of fire visible even through cloud. Among the flames were civilians, cooks, drivers, conscripts who had dropped their weapons days earlier. Many had no radios, no orders. They were simply running. By the time the smoke cleared, thousands of vehicles lay mangled in the dust. The air smelled of diesel rubber and something human. One Marine who passed through later wrote, "It was like walking through the end of the world." The images shocked even those who had authorized the strikes. Reporters granted access after the ceasefire filmed endless rows of wreckage tanks fused to asphalt, burned shoes scattered like leaves. The footage aired globally within hours. For the coalition, it was victory. For the world, it bordered on horror. Critics called it slaughter. Supporters called it justice. Either way, the highway of death became a name carved into history, the moment triumph and tragedy blurred into one. Elsewhere, the war raged on. South of Basra, the U.S. 7 Corps clashed with Iraq's Republican Guard in a series of armored duels that decided the campaign. At 73 Eastern American M1A1 Abrams tanks met the Tawakkalna division head-on in a blinding sandstorm. In 6 hours, the Iraqis lost more than 150 tanks. The Americans won Bradley. At Norfolk and Medina Ridge, the pattern repeated. Iraq's elite divisions shattered under precision gunnery and infrared optics. When the smoke cleared, the guard that had once been Saddam's pride was a ruin of twisted steel. On the morning of February 27th, U.S. Marines entered Kuwait City. The Kuwaiti flag was raised again over government buildings, its fabric rippling through smoke. Citizens cheered and wept, pressing flowers into the hands of soldiers who looked too stunned to react. In Washington, Bush announced Kuwait is liberated, Iraq's army is defeated. The words were measured, but the relief was visible. The war had lasted just 100 hours on the ground. In military terms, it was a masterpiece speed coordination and overwhelming force. Yet even in its perfection, something felt unresolved. Saddam Hussein was still alive. His regime still stood. In the White House, some advisors urged a final push to Baghdad, arguing that the tyrant's survival would poison the peace. Others warned that removing him would mean occupation insurgency, an endless war. Bush chose restraint. The mission as defined by the United Nations was to expel Iraq from Kuwait, nothing more. Anything beyond that would rewrite the rules. "We are not in the business of half measures," he said, "but neither are we in the business of conquest." The order went out to halt all offensive operations by dawn, February 28th. In the desert, the guns fell silent. Pilots circled above burning oil fields, watching the last plumes rise like black rivers into the sun. On the ground, soldiers stared across the horizon, unsure whether they had witnessed an ending or a beginning. The coalition had won every battle. Yet for those who could still hear the wind moving through the wreckage on Highway 80, victory no longer sounded like triumph. It sounded like an echo fading into smoke. At 8:00 a.m. on February 28, 1991, the war that had set the desert on fire finally went silent. Coalition forces halted their advance engines, idling beneath a sky that still bled black from the burning wells of Kuwait. The ceasefire was sudden, almost anticlimactic. After months of buildup and weeks of destruction, the end arrived not with a roar, but with exhaustion. Soldiers stood among the ruins, unsure whether to cheer or sit down. The battlefield stretched endlessly, a graveyard of vehicles, helmets, and torn flags. The air shimmered with heat, heavy with oil smoke and the metallic scent of spent ammunition. Kuwait lay liberated but not alive. 600 oil wells blazed across its horizon, pillars of flame rising hundreds of feet into the sky. The sun disappeared behind soot. Day turned to dusk. The world seemed trapped between night and morning. In Kuwait City, the scenes were surreal. Civilians emerged from basements waving flags through falling ash. Streets once patrolled by Iraqi troops filled with shouts of relief and disbelief. Photographs of the emir reappeared in shop windows. Families embraced soldiers as if to confirm they were real. But the liberation also revealed horrors. Mass graves outside the city, looted homes, and the wreckage of a nation burned in both victory and retreat. Freedom One Kuwaiti doctor said arrived wearing the color of smoke. In Washington, President Bush addressed the world. His voice was calm. His phrasing deliberate. Kuwait is liberated. The Gulf is free. He spoke of a new world order, one governed by law, not conquest, but beneath the celebration lay a strategic restraint. The coalition had stopped short of Baghdad. The United Nations mandate was fulfilled. To go further would mean invasion, occupation, and chaos. Our mission was to end the aggression, Bush said, not to destroy Iraq. In Baghdad, Saddam Hussein appeared on television in uniform, smiling thinly, congratulating his victorious army for surviving against the whole world. It was a lie, but a calculated one. The dictator had lost the war, yet he had not lost power. He emerged from the ruins bloodied but alive, a man whose survival would shape the next decade. Outside his palaces, the capital was silent. Bridges lay in rubble factories, gutted hospitals dark. Iraq was a country alive only in name. Then came the uprisings. In the south, Shiite rebels in Basra and Karbala rose against Saddam, believing the United States would back them. In the north, Kurdish fighters seized towns across the mountains. For a moment it seemed the regime might collapse from within. But the promised American support never came. The coalition, unwilling to fracture Iraq or risk a wider civil war, watched from beyond the border as Saddam unleashed his helicopters and tanks. The rebellions were crushed within weeks, entire cities left in ruins. Tens of thousands were killed while the world turned its cameras away. For the soldiers still stationed along the Kuwaiti frontier, the restraint was bitter. We fought to free a country, one Marine wrote, and watched another burn. The victory that had seemed absolute now felt uncertain, clean in execution, but blurred in consequence. As the months passed, the fires in Kuwait raged on. Engineers from around the world battled the inferno using dynamite and seawater to cap the burning wells. It took 7 months to extinguish them all. When the final flame died, the desert lay black and silent, its surface crusted with soot like cooled lava. The war was over, but its legacy had only begun. Sanctions tightened around Iraq, strangling its economy. Hunger spread. Power grids failed. Saddam stayed in power by tightening his grip. The victory that had promised a new world order instead created a fragile peace built on smoke and denial. For those who had fought beneath that burning sky, the memory was eternal, a horizon of fire, a silence that hummed with what might have been, and a question left unanswered. What if they had kept going? The Gulf War ended quickly, but its aftermath stretched for years, an uneasy calm smoldering beneath the surface. Iraq was a defeated nation, yet its ruler still stood. The United States called the campaign a triumph of unity and precision, but what followed looked less like victory and more like purgatory. In the spring of 1991, the world saw what Iraq had become. Entire neighborhoods of Basra lay in ruins, their walls etched with soot. Bridges that once carried commerce across the Tigris now sagged like broken spines. Fields turned barren irrigation canals choked with ash. The country's infrastructure, its power plants, its factories, its refineries had been methodically dismantled. For a regime that survived through control, this destruction was humiliation made permanent. Saddam ruled through fear, and fear returned fast. His secret police hunted those suspected of rebellion. Prisons overflowed. The Shiite south was crushed beneath artillery. Kurdish towns in the north were bombed and burned. The same helicopters that had once fled from coalition airstrikes now rained death on civilians. Tens of thousands fled toward the Turkish border, stumbling through snow and mud, clutching children who had forgotten how to cry. The mountains filled with refugees, a tragedy too large to ignore. And so even after peace, the war did not end. Western powers established no-fly zones over northern and southern Iraq, invisible borders enforced by American, British, and French jets. Operation Provide Comfort began in the north, delivering aid to Kurdish refugees while patrolling the skies to prevent further massacres. In the south, Operation Southern Watch kept Saddam's aircraft grounded. These peacekeeping missions would continue not for months, but for 12 years, turning the Gulf into a permanent theater of tension. For the pilots enforcing the zones, it was a war without front lines, a daily choreography of warnings, interceptions, and strikes that never made headlines. They flew over the same desert they had conquered, watching the smoke still rise from oil-soaked soil. "We called it peace," one pilot later said, but it never felt that way. It was just quieter. Inside Iraq, sanctions deepened the misery. The embargo imposed by the United Nations crippled trade medicine and food supply. Hospitals ran without equipment, classrooms emptied. The price of soap rose higher than bread. By the mid-1990s, UNICEF estimated that hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children had died from preventable diseases and malnutrition. The war that was meant to be short had become a long starvation. And yet Saddam's grip only tightened. He rebuilt his image as the defender of Iraq against the West. State television showed endless footage of him walking through bombed-out neighborhoods, distributing cash with a camera following every gesture. His portrait hung in every shop, every school, every home. The more isolated Iraq became, the more it revolved around one man's defiance. Outside Iraq, the war's aftershocks rippled across the region. The presence of American troops in Saudi Arabia, the land of Mecca and Medina, angered millions of Muslims who saw it as a desecration. Radical clerics condemned it as occupation disguised as protection. Among those listening was a wealthy Saudi exile named Osama bin Laden, who would soon declare his own war against America. The seeds of the next global conflict were already taking root in the shadow of the last. By the end of 1991, Kuwait rebuilt. Its oil fields burned out and were reignited, its skyline cleansed of smoke. But Iraq remained trapped, a wounded nation under siege ruled by a man who had mistaken survival for victory. In Washington, officials called the Gulf War a success, limited, decisive, and moral. But within the Pentagon, some wondered if they had merely paused a story that would resume in another decade. We ended the war, one general said quietly, but not the reason for it. The desert was quiet again, but not empty. Beneath the dunes lay wreckage that would never be unearthed, tanks buried by wind rifles rusting under sand, dog tags swallowed by time. The silence was not peace. It was waiting. When the fires finally dimmed and the satellites turned away, one truth remained: the Gulf War had not just been fought, it had been seen. For the first time in human history, battle unfolded in real time, projected from a war zone into the living rooms of the world. From the first flash of tracer rounds above Baghdad to the black plumes rising over Kuwait, millions watched every explosion, every press briefing, every grainy feed from the front. CNN called it the first live war. Anchors narrated the destruction with the calm cadence of newscasters reading the weather. Cameras mounted on precision bombs turned killing into choreography. To audiences in New York, London, and Tokyo, the images felt distant, clean, efficient, strangely bloodless. For the people under those explosions, it was anything but. Yet the illusion stuck: war had become spectacle. This was more than television. It was transformation. For the United States, the Gulf War restored what Vietnam had taken: the belief that wars could be won swiftly, technologically, and with minimal sacrifice. The term surgical strike entered the vocabulary of politics and marketing alike. Defense contractors became household names. Generals briefed reporters using computer graphics instead of maps. It was not just a victory on the battlefield, it was a triumph of perception. But perception comes with a cost. Beneath the glow of patriotism, the deeper questions went unanswered. Why was Saddam left in power? What did liberation mean for the people still dying under sanctions? Could a war televised like entertainment ever truly be understood? For a time, few cared to ask. The cameras had already moved on. Saddam stayed wounded, defiant, and more isolated than ever. He rebuilt his regime atop ruin, holding parades beneath murals of past glory. To his people, he promised resistance. To the world, he promised compliance while quietly defying the inspectors who searched for weapons of mass destruction. The uneasy peace hardened into containment, a 12-year stalemate policed by no-fly zones and airstrikes that came without headlines. For Washington, the war became doctrine. The Powell Doctrine: overwhelming force, limited goals, swift withdrawal, defined an era. It shaped the logic of every future conflict: control the image. Keep casualties low, leave before the story changes. The Gulf War proved that victory in the modern age could be measured not only in territory taken, but in how cleanly it could be shown on screen. And yet history has no pause button. The children who grew up under sanctions, the soldiers who never truly left the region, the radicals who saw American bases on holy soil, all carried the echoes of 1991 forward. A decade later, those echoes would erupt again in a different war against a familiar sky. In the desert, time began to erase the evidence. Wind buried the wreckage. Dunes swallowed the scars. Tourists driving along Highway 80 years later saw nothing but heat haze and horizon, unaware that beneath their wheels lay a graveyard of metal and ash. Only from the air, the same view that once delivered destruction could faint. Outlines still be seen like bruises on the earth. The Gulf War ended where it began, in light and shadow. Fire over oil fields, cameras over cities, power over truth. It was the war that made modern conflict visible, and in doing so taught the world to look and to look away. Long after the last flame in Kuwait was extinguished, the desert remained haunted by its memory. Wind swept over the old battlefields, uncovering fragments of the past: a rusted helmet, a melted cartridge, the outline of a burned convoy etched into sand like a scar that refused to fade. Time softened the edges, but not the story. For the veterans who returned home, the war followed quietly in photographs, in sleep, in the strange silence that comes after overwhelming noise. They remembered the horizon glowing red at midnight, the taste of dust, the feeling that they had fought not only an enemy, but the future itself. It was the first war of a new age, digital, instantaneous, watched by millions, yet understood by few. For Iraq, the wounds deepened long after the bombs stopped falling. The sanctions, the isolation, the no-fly zones, they all blurred together into a single word that defined a generation waiting. Waiting for food, for power, for another war that everyone knew would come. When it finally did in 2003, the explosions over Baghdad looked almost the same, only the cameras had changed. And for the world, the lesson lingered that modern war can be won swiftly and lost slowly. The Gulf War proved that power and precision could achieve near-total dominance, but not peace. It showed that images could shape history as much as armies. It reminded humanity that victory when televised risks becoming theater. Today, the dunes of the Gulf lie still again. The oil wells burn no more, but their smoke once wrote a warning across the sky, a message to all who watched and forgot that even when the world stops fighting, the desert remembers.